right, this is a good study here. Genesis chapter 39. We'll title it Resisting and Overcoming Temptation Like Joseph. Now this would be another one of these chapters that I would, it's not, if I was just to pick and choose what chapters of the Bible I wanted to read, I'd probably ignore this one. I'd say, oh, well, I want to find something prophetic. I don't want to read about righteous Joseph, that guy was so perfect that, I don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about him. But it's interesting because in chapter 38, the last chapter, we read about Judah's sexual weakness and moral shortcomings. But in this chapter, we're going to see the complete opposite. We're going to see a moral man, obviously Joseph, who disciplined himself daily to resist all kinds of temptations, including, as we're going to see here, the temptations of an aggressive and no doubt very beautiful woman. And as some of us guys are going to be reading about Joseph here, it becomes obvious to us that this guy was something else. He was something special in regards to his personal discipline and so forth. Besides Christ himself, there probably isn't a greater godly example in the Bible of purity and virtue. Joseph's life, when you look at it, it's really fascinating because it's an example. His whole life is an example of what we can learn from, or I should say, the way he lived his life is how every Christian should set their mark to try to be like a Joseph, to try to live like him. And you might be thinking, well, that's impossible. I'll never be like Joseph. Joseph was some supernatural character that God made, and God just zapped him with all these wonderful qualities, of virtue and so forth. But I guess you could continue on thinking in your mind that, thank God we're in the New Testament. I'm a wretched sinner saved by the grace of God. I don't need to be like Joseph. Well, that may be true, but the born-again Christian, once you become born again, we're always supposed to be striving to resist sin. It's not enough to say, oh, by the grace of God, there go I, and treat sin as though it's just something that's going to happen no matter what. And you're not even going to try to resist it, okay? Joseph, as we're going to see here, had to put effort into resisting it. It didn't just come easy to him. There were things that he did day by day, things that he disciplined himself to do on the little things, right? It started with the little things. Had Joseph not disciplined himself on the little things, when a great temptation came to him, like this beautiful woman, basically, just trying to force him, trying to keep this clean here with the kids here. But, he had to, in order for him to resist that, he had to have been daily practicing discipline in morals and ethics and things like that. Otherwise, that kind of temptation coming that quick, he would have just, like a lot of guys would do today, they just would have fell for it just to please the pleasures of the flesh. But, I think Joseph's life is, our ministry is called Christian Overcomers. But I think I never really looked at Joseph really as the model overcomer. We think of King David and Joshua, those warriors that I usually tend to like because that was just my personality. You go get the Philistines, you kill the bad guys, not literally for me, but it was, those guys are what inspired me more than anything else, the aggressive combatants. But Joseph here just didn't really catch my attention, and he should have, because he really was probably one of the greatest warriors of all time, except he was fighting a different kind of war. He was fighting a spiritual war. He was resisting temptation and always overcoming. In fact, when you look at Joseph's life, he would go from one bad thing. You'd think, man, if that was me and I was put in this situation, I would just blame God and want to quit. But Joseph always made the best out of every situation he was in and figured out a way to work himself up, not just by hard work, as we're going to find out. He was a very diligent, hardworking man, but he was very loyal to whoever he was under. He was not only loyal to his masters according to the flesh, but he was obedient to God first and foremost. And that's why God picked him to be such a special character. But anyways, you know, as we read through this, I'll just say one more thing. We today are always being put in situations like Joseph. We're put in situations of various kinds of temptation. So again, when we look at his life, it's encouraging to us to look at him and try to use him as our mark of, hey, I want to be like Joseph. I want to strive and overcome. And then other people, I remember when I first started studying the Bible, I was involved with a certain group of people who loved studying the Bible, and a lot of great people. But some of my friends growing up, they'd read stories like David. You know, he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and Judah, like we read the last chapter, he was struggling with his own sexual temptations. And they would kind of glamorize those guys, like, yeah, well, Judah did it, David did it, I'm not so bad, you know. And some of them I even use it as an excuse to do those things. And so it's interesting how God has this orchestrated in the Bible. You go from Judah, who had no self-discipline over temptation and sexual urges, whereas Joseph was a master over those kinds of temptations, as we're going to see here. Okay. Enough rambling on. That's enough introduction here. Genesis chapter 39, verse 1. And it reads, And Joseph was brought down to Egypt. An officer, let me just go to this. Okay. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. Okay, you remember a couple chapters ago, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and now here's Joseph. I mean, looking like life's over almost. For many people would look at this as though life's over, I'm a slave, but not with Joseph. Check this out. Verse 2, And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So even as a slave, Joseph found out a way to be prosperous. And of course, that's because God blessed him. But God didn't just bless him because he liked Joseph and thought, oh, I'm just going to play favorites. He blessed Joseph because of the virtue and the character that he could see in Joseph. He knew what kind of guy Joseph was going to be. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Now think about that for a minute. This master was an Egyptian. He was a pagan guy. In fact, I think Potiphar means dedicated to the sun, or obedient to the sun, and it had to do with the fact that he was obedient to Pharaoh, who was known as like the sun god, you know, at that time. In other words, he was a very dedicated pagan man. But because God was blessing Joseph, Joseph's life was actually a witness not only to this Egyptian, but also to other Egyptians that were around. I guess the point is, today we live in a world that's becoming more and more paganized, and we have no idea of the impact of how we live our lives day to day, of how that will affect those around us. We don't know who that could change, who that could reform, who that could eventually get saved. And that's not, Joseph wasn't going over there preaching to the Egyptians. He was just minding his business, working hard and being loyal. He wasn't going to the Egyptians and saying, do you know Jesus? Well, of course, Jesus wasn't there at the time, but he wasn't a pest or a nuisance, knocking on people's doors, bothering them. Now, I'm not saying that's always a bad thing to do, but we do see that Joseph spread the light of the kingdom just by the way he lived his life. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him and made him overseer over his house and all that he had put into his hand. Now think about that. He starts out as a slave, and now He's an overseer over this great prominent Egyptian officials over many things that this guy oversees. In other words, that guy pretty much just let Joseph do his job for him. Because Joseph was so diligent in management and hard work and probably dealing with people. Joseph was fair. And this guy knew that, hey, this Joseph, the Egyptian guy, he knew that Joseph was blessed and everything Joseph touched prospered. So he's like, just going to let this guy have charge of all this stuff, and I'm just going to get out of his way and let him do his thing because this is good for me. Anybody think of how that would apply to today? Well, if you work for an employer, we'd want to be like a Joseph, right? If you want to get advanced in your field of expertise or whatever, Joseph is the perfect example of that. You work hard, you're diligent, you're loyal, and you obey God, and God will see to it that you'll rise up to whatever you're capable of handling. Verse 5, and it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. Now check that out. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house. These were pagans. For whose sake? For Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. So, as Christian families, we can be a blessing to our community, to other people. I mean, our community, our other family members that are connected to us can be blessed if we're blessed, if we're doing the things that God has commanded us to do. So, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, God, you see an example of God's mercy there where He'll actually bless non-believers for the sake of a believer. So it is important what we do. Now, the grace, the cheap, slippery grace crowd that really pretty much makes up most of mainstream Christianity today. They say, don't try to be like a Joseph. Don't work hard. Don't value any of those things because that's works of the flesh, man. Just believe and be saved. And by the grace of God, there go I. We're all just rotten sinners and we don't even need to try. That type of a mentality. It's everywhere. I mean, the reason why I harp on that is because almost every mainstream Christian church you go to today takes that route. Now you could take the other route and you could become a self-righteous hypocrite and say you're a perfect moral character, probably better than Joseph, or type of thing. So it's important that we don't swing to the extreme of either side. The church, unfortunately, in an effort probably to avoid being a Pharisee or a hypocrite, has gotten so left-wing or so liberal that they think they are like the gods of grace or something. They think they are perfect. It's fascinating because they've become Pharisees in a different sense. They're self-righteous hypocrites in the sense that they think they show so much grace to everybody. I'm so nice, I'm so sweet, and you guys over there that pound on your Bible, you're mean. You need to be a little bit more compassionate and so forth. Yeah, you can have some mean, people that are not compassionate Bible thumpers. I'm not saying that, but all right, I'll move on before I dig too deep on that one. All right, verse 6. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had. He didn't even worry about what he had. He didn't even check the books and look at the records. That's how trustworthy Joseph was. He knew Joseph wasn't going to be ripping him off, stealing from him, because he saw Joseph every day practicing moral discipline, virtue, loyalty, obedience. Save the bread which he did eat, and Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. Okay, very good example of a godly man here. And it came to pass after these things that his master's that his master's wife, that was the Egyptian, what did she do? She cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." pretty aggressive nature here. And a lot of guys probably would look at this as, hey, this is a great opportunity. Why would you pass this up? I mean, this Egyptian woman was probably, she's looking at me with eyes like, you better not be one of those guys. Why would you pass up that opportunity? Because, hey, this is a prominent Egyptian official. This woman, I'm sure, was not, I'm going to try to be nice and not, she was not an unattractive girl, okay? I would put money on it, okay? Otherwise, this whole temptation that Joseph was going through, it's not really proving a point then, because any guy could resist a girl that was very, very unattractive. It wouldn't, it's not like she was some 400-pound woman chasing him down and he's running away, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. All right. I didn't want to say that because I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but it gets the point across, I think. All right, lie with me, all right? But he refused. Now check that out. But he refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. Look at his first response in rejecting her advance here was, this would be disloyal to my master. And he's given me all this. Why would I turn around and then violate his trust in such a terrible way? Why would I do that? So, while we're here, I want to mention something. Jesus told us that we were supposed to pray, I don't know if he said daily, but when he gave the Lord's Prayer, and I think it was Matthew chapter, 6 or something like that, he said, pray like this. He said, lead us not, give us this day our daily bread, and all that. Everybody knows the Lord's Prayer. But there's that one part that is very interesting and applies to this study. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Okay? This woman's advance really was, it would be really easy for a lot of guys to overcome some of this stuff, a lot of Christian guys that might struggle with this kind of stuff. If they looked at this woman as it's not that woman, but it's the powers behind that woman that's influencing her. In other words, if you looked at this woman and you somehow could stamp Satan's name on her forehead, she then becomes, no matter how attractive she is at the time, she then becomes very ugly when you realize, I'm not going to go sleep with Satan. So that might help some of the younger guys listening in on there. When you see that, just picture you're going to sleep. You want to sleep with Satan? Yuck. That becomes kind of gross then. But anyways, let me go over here. Okay. All right, continuing on. And it came to pass as she spake to Joseph. Now check this out. Day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her or to be with her. Every day she was coming on to him saying, lie with me, sleep with me. And probably giving him all kinds of reasons why he should. Doesn't go into that detail. Probably says nobody will know, nobody will find out about it. We'll hide in the corner here or whatever. Every day she was probably coming up with a new strategy. I'm sure, being the conniving woman that she was here, she wasn't just saying the same thing every day. She wasn't just coming up to him saying, lie with me, Joseph, lie with me. She was coming up with new tactics, I'm sure. But we think about this. Every day our men, if we want to apply this to a different level here, every day our men are seduced with imagery on TV, the internet, you name it. Half-naked girls here, half-naked girls there. And you could look at this woman as a type of that, a type of how our men are constantly being seduced to think according to base carnality. Rather than, and Satan knows this, it's his trick. All the Proverbs talk about this adulterous woman or this whorish woman. If she convinces the man to go with her, he doesn't know it, but it's to his destruction, it's to his death. In other words, it really degrades him to the point where he loses all of his dignity, his morality, and then he goes from being a man to something that he doesn't want to be, okay? But there's something even deeper than this that a lot of people don't think about. There's another woman in the book of Revelation who does this very exact same thing to all of us all the time. We talked about her a little bit in our current events message, but it's the feel-good church. The feel-good church. What does she promise? Pleasure. Sensations of the flesh. It could even include worship music. If it's not, you could have worship music and all that good feel-good stuff you want, but if it's not based, if you then get to the message and it's not based off the Bible or it's not the Word of God, then it becomes nothing but sensationalism and feel-good pleasures for the flesh, even though you don't think of it as a sexual thing. But it's actually more of a violation in God's eyes because it's called idolatry, which is even worse than this. But I don't want to take away from the importance here and say this is only spiritual, because it's both physical, spirit, and spiritual. This woman here. Now, some would say, well, give me an example of that. How does the church try to tempt us today? How does the mainstream church try to tempt us today to commit some kind of a spiritual fornication or adultery? Well, think about it. You must be loving and tolerant of, let's say, the LGBTQ community. Right there, that is an act of an adultery. If you violate God's word and say, yeah, I think what those people do is okay, it's an alternative lifestyle, you've just given in to that seduction. Why? Because it felt good to you. Everybody loves you because of it, right? If you say you're against it, then you're going to be like a Joseph, and we're going to see what happens to him when he rejects it, okay? He's going to be treated very poorly. He's going to be lied about, slandered, and so forth. So let's continue on here. But he hearkened not unto her to lie with her or to be with her. Now, it's interesting. It seems like he tried he didn't only say no to her, but he didn't even want to be around her. Okay? Now, a lot of times people flirt with sin. They'll say, well, I'm not really going to commit a sin here, but I just want to hang around and see what will happen, or type of thing. All right. Verse 11. And it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. Now check that out. Being a loyal worker, minding his own business, just going to work. And there was none of the men of the house there within, just Joseph. What do you guys think is going to happen? Anybody want to guess? Just Joseph all alone? We have those eyes that were looking for Joseph here. Think about how it's almost a demonic thing, how this woman, because she couldn't have Joseph, she didn't give up. She just kept going and going day by day. We don't even know how many years this might have went on for. I'll bring this to the other level again. Think of the spiritual church. Come into our church. Come in here. We're welcoming. We make you feel good. We worship. We do all this. Come. You should come to church. You should come to church. And that's good, but if it's not coming to a church where they're teaching the Bible, then it's this other woman. It's not being the lawful wife. It's participating with the unlawful, idolatrous whoredom, if you would. Okay? All right, here we go. Verse 12. I know you guys are saying, just get to the next verse. I want to see what happens. And she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. Okay? So now she gets to the point where he's all alone. He's saying no. Now she's going to force him. And I worked with a bunch of guys that if I read this verse, they'd say, well, what's the problem with that, man? Wow, that's great for him, But, so you see here, this is, Joseph, he didn't even wait or hesitate. He just took off. He was probably, the robes or clothing that they wore back then, he probably ran out in his underwear. So it must have, for him to do that had to have been, I would have probably been trying to get my coat back at least. But evidently he didn't want to take any chances. He was just out of there. But another lesson is, look at how fast Joseph fled from sin. Again, I mentioned earlier that sometimes we like to hang around sin and say, well, let's just see what happens. I'll just hang around a little bit, but then I'm going to eventually say no to it or whatever it is. And I'm not just talking about sexual things. It could be anything that tempts us that we know we shouldn't be doing or we shouldn't have. We like to flirt with that. But Joseph he had his mind made up already. He was not giving in to this woman. Now, I would say again, that woman of Revelation chapter 18, I forgot to reference the verse, that represents the false church. We have to have it in our mind that we are not giving in to that woman. No matter what kind of trick she plays on us, no matter how the feel-good stuff she does to us, no matter how good she smells or whatever. I'm out of there. I'm not listening to her. I'm not going down to the pits of hell with that woman, right? In fact, you look at Joseph's life, I said it earlier, there's a stark contrast between the religion of Joseph and the feel-good churches today. I'm just reading from my note here. Joseph feared God. You notice Joseph feared God. What is one thing that's missing from our churches today? Yes. They don't fear God. The fear of God. This is what actually motivated Joseph to be obedient. Of course, later it's actually, part of fear is actually love. So it's not just that he was totally terrified of God. It's just that he loved and respected God enough to fear how it would hurt God to do such a thing. So Joseph is the type of the true Christian, whereas, yes, you could almost pull Judah out as an example of somebody who was a feel-good grace guy, thought he could just commit adultery and get away with it and hide it and all that kind of stuff. But anyways, Joseph, I could say it this way. Joseph is the true Christian, the true overcomer, and the woman that's trying to seduce him is the false one, okay? Let's just have pleasure. Again, let's just feel good. Cheap grace. If my master finds us, he'll forgive you somehow. I'll convince him or whatever. Who knows the kind of stuff she was saying. But if you want to make a note of it, Revelation 18 verse 2 talks about Mystery Babylon. And it says there in verse 3, it says, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." Now think of this woman. I'm sure Joseph wasn't the only man that she seduced. If she probably wanted Joseph all that much more, because Joseph was probably one of the few that ever even resisted her. She probably got whatever she wanted most of the time, swept it under the rug, and used her position as she probably, in the first place, she probably married Potiphar for, fame and fortune, power, political power. It was probably a relationship just to get worldly gain from. It had to have been. Otherwise, she wouldn't be cheating on him or trying to with Joseph. But anyways, if you read on in Revelation 18, it talks about this woman, Mystery Babylon, the great harlot of the earth. But the important point I want to make here, and this is what Joseph did, and in verse 4 it says, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities.'" And Joseph understood this. He didn't want any part of the sin he didn't want to partake of any of the aftermath of what that sin would have brought to him and his life, both physically and spiritually. All right, here we go. "And it came to pass when," verse 13 of Genesis 39, "and it came to pass when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of her house and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in Hebrew," referring to her master. Now she's blaming her husband. Think about this. This is twisted. "See, he hath," my master, my husband, "hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice." So now she's accusing Joseph of attempted rape. After all this, you think about that. That's what lust ends in. It's not true love. She didn't love Joseph. She didn't want to have a relationship with him. She only wanted what she wanted to make herself feel good. Probably both sexually and some kind of a control thing, possibly. Verse 15, and it came to pass when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled and got him out. Now she's a very smart woman here, very devious, because not only she was smart enough to know, because back in these times and even in biblical law, if a woman was about to be raped, it was her duty to scream out loud so somebody would hear. Otherwise, many cases the woman could just say, well, she could commit adultery and just say, well, I didn't really want to. He forced me. But the cry or her scream would be part of the evidence that it was not her will. It was not what she wanted to do. So she adds that in to protect herself now. She says, I screamed out loud and then he ran. And he laid up his garment by her and she laid up his garment by her until the Lord came home. So now she's even using the clothes that she ripped off of him as so-called evidence that he tried to rape her. Now think about this. This is the second time Joseph's garment was involved in something treacherous. First, it was the coat of many colors that his brothers took and then ripped off of him and then put animal blood on to try to deceive their dad into believing that he was dead. And now we have a woman here taking his garment and using it as evidence against Joseph in a fraudulent way. Interesting. And she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. She says, he did. How did you let this happen? Can you just imagine her putting on the show here? How could you let this happen? That man you brought in here, that Hebrew, that slave boy, you brought him in here and he tried to violate me. So now she's using, what do you call that? She's manipulating her husband to blame Joseph rather than her. So this is kind of like the Democrat Party. This is kind of like what the Democrat Party does, by the way. They're guilty of the thing that they accuse everybody else of, and they say it louder than anybody else to get everybody to believe them. I'm sure most people bought into this. There were probably a lot of jealous Egyptians. Joseph, this good-looking guy, comes in here, hard worker. He rises above all of us, and he was just a slave. They're probably rejoicing at this. Yeah, Joseph. I knew there was something wrong with that guy, Verse 18, and it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. Did I read that twice? Okay, 19. And it came to pass when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. He bought the deception. I'm sure, I had a family member who had a wife like this. Very deceptive. He would just believe anything that... she would just keep playing on him and get him to believe any lie, And she was very manipulative here. He bought it. Now he's angry at Joseph. Could you imagine how Joseph might feel? How would you feel if you resisted this day in and day out? Now you're being accused of doing something worse than the thing that you tried not to do. Now he's accused of potential rape, attempted rape, which is even worse than adultery. So, and notice God here isn't actually going to jump in and save him. So we can see here that God will let us go through trials, false accusations, low points in our life to mold us into the kind of servant that he wants us to be. In fact, I have no doubt God allowed this to happen to Joseph because Joseph went from being a slave. He rose up to this position of a pretty high position in Egypt under this wealthy master, Egyptian master. Now he's going to come down low again. But guess what? he's eventually going to rise up way above where he was. So God was conditioning him, testing him. And you notice Joseph never complains once about this. He doesn't even try to defend himself. Now, because he probably thought, if I try to defend myself, nobody's going to believe me. So I'm just going to take it and go with it and trust in God. And it's interesting because this is a very interesting overlay or type of what Jesus did on the cross. He was falsely accused of all kinds of things, but yet he kept his mouth silent and knew that in the end God would raise him up above all these accusations. Verse 20, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. There are other scriptures, I forgot to write them down to cite to you, but in the book of Psalms it talks about how Joseph's hands and his feet were hurt with fetters of iron. So he didn't just go into this prison and have a good time. He was probably tortured for quite a while in there with iron, heavy iron ankle and hand chains. So no doubt Joseph later on probably had scars from all this imprisonment. I mean, this guy who could withstand this kind of stuff? I look at this and I'm like, I'd like to try to be like Joseph, but man, that is that's a pretty high mark. If I could just be a little bit like Joseph, that would be nice. Okay, let me see here. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph. Now check this out. Even though he was in a dungeon, he had been falsely accused, he's in the lowest point of his life, God was still with him and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So now Joseph here, and no doubt God helped him gain favor, but Joseph had a part in it as well. God just didn't magically wave his wand and say, be nice to Joseph. Joseph in turn had a good attitude, no doubt. Now he's like, hey, I'm here now. What can I do? I'm going to make the best of it. I'm a prisoner. I was a slave, now I'm a prisoner. I'm just going to be the best dang prisoner I can be. All right, so moving on. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand, here we go again, all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. Here he goes again. No doubt his daily work ethic, his discipline, you name it, got him now, of course, along with God's hand being there, got him to move up to now he's in charge of the prison. Now he's in charge of the prison. A lot of people would just start blaming God at this point. And obviously, in fact, I should bring this up because this is probably the greater temptation that Joseph went through. We thought the woman was tempting, right? She's probably a beautiful woman coming on to him. But it was probably harder for Joseph to resist being upset that he's in this spot in the first place. So it's probably harder for him to resist blaming God for it than it was to run away from that woman. You think about it. If you were in this spot, you say, I didn't do anything wrong. Here I am obeying God. I'm doing my work. I'm not causing any trouble, and I just keep ending up in these bad spots. First, my brothers sold me into slavery. They were going to kill me, and then now I'm in prison for something I didn't do. So the overcomer would get to that point and say, God's with me, I'm gonna see it through, okay? Now a lot of people think about this, we sometimes look at this, did this all happen in like a year? No, this was probably, I can't remember I was trying to break down the timeline of this, but this happened over like a decade of period of time. Joseph's success didn't come overnight. It was he didn't just, like I said, God didn't just wave his wand and say, Joseph, be successful here. Joseph, be successful there. It was a daily grind, no doubt, that Joseph went through while running from these temptations that got him to where he's going to be. Okay, verse 23, and the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did the Lord made to prosper. Okay, so in closing here, Besides Christ himself, there probably isn't a better example of an overcomer than Joseph. I mean, he was it. He was, like I said, he was thrown into the pit by his brothers. He was sold into slavery, rose to a position of overseer for a prominent Egyptian official, withstood the temptation of a seductive woman, falsely accused of attempted rape, thrown in prison, became overseer of the prison that he was cast into, and later became, as we're going to see in the coming chapters, the second in command next to the Pharaoh himself. And he accomplished all of this by never giving up. He never gave up. Whatever situation Joseph found himself in, he made the best of it. And just to repeat myself again, through his diligent work ethic, excellent management skills, moral discipline, trustworthiness, loyalty, and obedience to God, he always rose to the top, no matter what obstacles Satan threw in his path. And the fascinating part about it is we don't have one recorded instance where he ever complained about it or felt sorry for himself. Any questions or comments?
Nope.
Nope? That was quick.
I feel like... Oh, go ahead.
You go first.
I feel like I have a little bit of a problem with him not saying anything. I know when Jesus was being crucified and tortured, that was a purpose that had to happen. So it didn't do any good for him to complain because he knew he had to go through it. But to not say something in his case, it seems, what would that, how would that be? If anything, it would make him, if you look at it today's perspective, it would make me think he's guilty.
Yeah.
Unless it just doesn't cover it there, but I would think at least saying, no, I did not do that. But if you're going to accuse me and there's nothing I can do to, prove it, so, but.
I got a theory on that. I think he was so loyal to his master that he probably thought of it as an insult to his master if he started then turning around and accusing his wife. I mean, that's the kind of guy he seemed to be. It's just like he had such great loyalty and virtue in him that he just, I see what you're saying. I'd want to point the finger at her too and say that's a damn lie. I didn't do that, but
yeah, that makes sense if he's that loyal. But then again, you could say, if my wife was cheating on me, I would like someone to tell me.
Right. But as a slave, he was still a slave too.
Right.
So maybe it was just it was something, it just wasn't even thinkable to question an Egyptian accusing you of something. So it could have been part of it too. But, yeah. Anybody else?
I first of all just love that there's so many young adults here today for this study on resisting temptation and purity and stuff like that. I just think it's such a perfect message for that age group. And then also, since you're a man, you speak to, Joseph being able to resist that woman. But for the gals, don't be that woman, especially towards your Christian brothers. Like, don't tempt them. It's your duty to stay pure and not tempt them and, help them walk the godly life that they're supposed to so that they can be, the man that they're supposed to be, the man that God wants them to be for you. So I just think it's a lesson for both male and female. For the girls, don't be like that, and for the guys, resist that.
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. Yeah, we have a do and a don't there. Don't be and a do be. Good point. Anybody else? No? Had enough of this talk about the crazy woman taking his robe from him? Yeah, maybe you'll remember it years from now and it'll help you.
I know I will. Yeah. Take it.
You understand it enough to it'll benefit you.
Yeah.
I found out how to connect Jacob's notes up to my notes.
Oh, cool.
Because I did that. So
He didn't. It's like
I just press something and then
his writing is on there.
10.
Is that? I hope the notes were about our Bible study today.
It actually was.
And then, I was just writing, and then it somehow,
It popped.
I went off, went to Blue Air Bible, then came back into OneNote, and then I see Jacob's notes.
Oh,
So then Jacob puts me back there, and then he goes right back. I'm like, are you kidding me? Then I go right back because I want to see his notes.
Okay.
okay. Sounds cool.
Good comment.
Oh,
I will also say that I just really appreciate that all the different churches I've been to and all the different things, that this line by line version, or what we do here, is just so refreshing, because like you said, this chapter isn't like the most exciting chapter, and but when you read the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse, you're forced to look at what God has to say to us, not just what the pastor wants us to hear about some popular scriptures. But I just say that because, I don't know, different people come from different backgrounds and things like that, and just want it to be known that that's why we do it this way, is that way you get every word that God wants you to hear, whether it's fun or exciting or bad or good or controversial or any of those things. So that's why next week it's going to be chapter 40.
Right.
And not just whatever, some kind of a feel-good story about your life. And
Yeah.
But I appreciate that.
Christian Overcomers is brought to you by the tithes and offerings of our listeners. If you would like to support our ministry, please go to ChristianOvercomers.com. God bless you, and thank you for your support.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on.